let me first introduce Janyce Stefan-Cole. She is the author of a novel, Hollywood Boulevard, which should be, I didn't see it when I came in, but it will be for sale outside at a discount. Her award-winning story, Conversation with a Tree, is included in the Being Human anthology. She's been a finalist for the James Jones First Novel Fellowship. She's included in the anthology Dick for a Day, and she's had publications in a range of other venues, too many to mention. And she's currently at work on her second novel. So, Janyce?
Thank you, Gregory. Thank you all for being here. Little Clark Kent moment here. Thank you, St. Francis, and the Evolutionary Studies Collaborative and Honors English for hosting this event. Thanks to my co-authors, Lisa and Anne. Can you hear me okay? So, Being Human, Call of the Wild. I wrote most of Conversation with a Tree in New Hampshire, where I'm lucky enough to spend a good part of each summer, in a fairly isolated setting, with silences that are vast enough so if a tree wanted to speak, it could be heard. It's kind of wilderness wild, a world apart from the urban wild of the latest smartphone apps, Facebook scribbles, all-night parties, or a night at the bar. I wanted to create a character who was tuned into something a little more, not immune to the enduring chaos of the human spirit, which I think lives alongside our supposedly civilized selves, a little wild, perhaps a little dangerous, but that if you hear it, can lift us out of our usual habits, perceptions, and presumptions. So with that, I'll read a few pages into the story, and you can decide for yourselves if the tree spoke or not. Conversation with a Tree. I want to tell you something that might make me sound crazy. I'm guessing you'll read on because you won't be able to help yourself. My former husband, John, said I was too intense. He didn't use the term inward gaze, but that's what he meant. And he didn't say crazy. Here goes. I'm seated in the sunroom next to a pile of research books on a developmental disorder stretched out on the chaise, and a few minutes ago I looked up from my reading to hear the tree outside the window speak. Are you still there? I'll change the subject for a moment to let the ideas sink in. Sometimes looking away is the best way to see. The sunroom is also known as the tripping room. My friend Andy gave it that name because it's a pentagon with 4 gigantic windows that look out onto fields and mountains beyond. The sunset views are spectacular, and it's a perfect room for smoking pot or eating hallucinogens. Andy is a musician, and that's all I'll say on mood-altering stimulants because you'll be tempted to think I was high on something just now when the tree spoke, but no, I'm sober as death. A blanket wrapped over my lap, since the summer day has turned chilly. Mists shroud the mountains, making them resemble a Chinese landscape painting, partially veiled in white. When the tree spoke, a cold dart of fear shot through my bowels. It's a fir, tall, offering generous shade on hot afternoons. Seen from the outside, the tree is perfectly shaped and could be an easy mark for sacrifice to the Rockefeller Center Christmas display. I was stalling just now. Trees cannot speak, right? But this tree did say the following sentence. I am here in the rain. You know it's raining. I mentally asked back. The tree said so, but I had trouble accepting that level of awareness. I know of certain hallucinogens that might make a person think they hear trees speak, that encourage the perception of interconnectedness among all things, like a luminous web at the subatomic level, stringing all that is together into a long cosmic necklace. Peyote is a good example. used by certain Central American Indian tribes for religious purposes. I have not heard a tree speak in the city. What about the cosmic necklace there? Are cities so dense and out of touch with whatever the saliva or plasma is that holds us all together that a kind of deafness sets in? This is my first summer alone up here, and the questions just come and go. Maybe the country air, while expanding my lungs and appetite, is loosening the gum of my sanity. Did the tree speak or not? My first instinct was denial. I do it all the time. One of my choicer ways to get through what could potentially be an insulting situation is to pretend that nothing happened. For example, I said nothing recently when a colleague suggested I was conventional in my research. And when he said on another occasion I was a romantic, I did not take up that challenge either. The way I see it, had I chosen to take exception, we might have spiraled into hair-splitting realms of meanings and effects. Endless clarifications could have followed, and possibly deeper misunderstandings, and even regrettable words exchanged. So I let it ride. Now, theoretically, people with the mental disorder I am researching have no concept of an insult, either given or received. Think of that for a moment. No greed, envy, hatred, no deceit, or any of the other lovely characteristics that work so hard to make us all so miserable. I'll return to the point. Here is where we are. Me sitting very still in the Pentagon room, safe from the now heavily falling rain, but apparently not from trees sneaking up with a new reality. I know I'm asking for a leap of faith. I don't like this any more than you do. I considered leaving, driving back to my concrete city apartment. The country house is made of wood that has been cut from trees like the one outside, milled and hammered and made to stand so people can walk and sleep and talk inside them. I worry sometimes, way back in a far corner of my mind, about the comforts and pleasures we take at the expense of others, plants and people. I don't have answers to the questions that have haunted great minds through the centuries. I have preferences, free-range eggs and pure cashmere, Côte du Rhône over Merlot, for example. But answers would require greater certainty about many things, none of which has anything to do with trees talking. I am in the country alone, and you're probably thinking, too alone. I mentioned my ex. Sadly, John grew into someone smug and uncharitable who made me feel afraid to express myself. I didn't see this in him at first, and can't be certain if he changed or if I had been blinded by his deep gray eyes, but even my mother agreed he had to go. I got the country house in the settlement. He got the brownstone with the wine cellar. By now it should be clear that I am not an inexperienced woman suddenly hearing things. I was hesitating to be too assertive, but the tree did speak. Looking at the muted tree line, the misty mountains beyond, hearing the birds twitter, less in the damp, but going about their daily business nevertheless. I see a very real landscape, not a web of threads through the belly button of all that lies before me, interconnected with invisible string. Yes, but up at the pond behind the house, there are some pretty primitive spectacles. I was in the canoe yesterday, way back in the part of the pond I would never swim in because back there the place creams with life. Take the filmy blobs that hang on the surface. I think they are tadpole beginnings or fish eggs. The floating jelly snots bubble with single-cell DNA, hinged to the water like something you might see in an intergalactic photograph. Flows of gaseous life, a mess of substance until, what? It boils into a planet or a star or a frog. See what I mean? It's easy out here to start having ideas about breathing protozoan being the glue and all of us as part of the same atomic muck. Oh, and lately, I've seen things flit by out of the corner of my eye. The other evening, I thought I saw my now-deceased ex-mother-in-law Marion pass by the kitchen window. I was outside, and she would have walked by the sink. I probably shouldn't have mentioned that. In the Bible, Moses talked to a burning bush, but it could have been a tree. Maybe my tree and I are meant to form a new sect. Unfortunately, I always come to the same stark dilemma with regard to the organized beliefs of the world. I can't do it. Not an ounce of comfort either, if that's the purpose. I've dealt with death, my dear father's demise early. I've been sick, one time dangerously so. I married a man who dissolved into my evil other, and not once in any of those instances did I think of surrendering my pain to an icon. Time passed, I healed. Studying the mind doesn't help either, because this complex piece of machinery, the human brain, can have so much go wrong with it, and we have no clue yet why it is here in the first place. Evolution? Some disallow it, preferring an anonymous genius at work. What about those who suffer the developmental disorder I am researching? They are assumed to be lost, but I am not so sure. I'm losing my focus. You might be wondering what wisdom the tree imparted. It certainly didn't offer advice on this paper I'm supposed to be writing. I didn't mean just now to cast the tree in a lesser light. Who could hate a tree? Suburban developers, big box stores, farmers find them inconvenient or profitable to slice. I have a friend who told me that one day when he was a kid, his father chopped down all the trees in their yard, big old trees. Maybe he'd grown fed up raking their leaves each autumn. Anyway, he later regretted what he'd done, but never explained why. Marion, my ex-mother-in-law, once hid my teapot. I have never been chipper in the morning. The utter fatigue of waking up is a trial. Neurologists tell us the mind never sleeps, is always tooling around, sorting through its biology, picking up bites from the surrounding night, if only from the bedclothes or the pillow texture, always on like a private city. Only coma and anesthesia shut the conscious process down, and even then, minute stimuli still excite the organism. We should have John cut another swath to the pond, Marion said, looking out the window that morning of the teapot. The wild turkeys will eat all the blueberries. I was silently searching for the teapot that had mysteriously left the place where I normally kept it. What do you think? A second path to the pond? The turkeys have no supermarkets, Marion. They're welcome to the blueberries, I said. You don't like blueberries? I love blueberries. What on earth are you looking for? The teapot. Have you seen it? Oh, that. I put it in the dining room. No one drinks tea. My father was British. I come from a long line of tea drinkers. I cannot have a day without my tea. How did my husband's mother fail to know this? I shuffled to the dining room. Marion, I called out weakly. Where in the dining room? What? Marion called from the kitchen. Oh, I couldn't find where it went, so I stuck it in the liquor cabinet. I found the pot tucked among the martini glasses and cocktail napkins. Marion, I remember saying, I'm a tea drinker. To which she replied, well, you grew up here and should drink as Americans do. That may have led to the first true moment of communion between me and the tree that spoke. I retreated from Marion to the Pentagon room to drink my tea among the harmonious offerings of nature. I'm sorry. My phone rang. Thank you.
Thank you, Janyce. I love that narrator. So we can have questions and answers later. Our second reader is Lisa Sita, who is a college administrator and an instructor. Lisa has written for a wide range of audiences, from children to adults, nonfiction, fiction, and memoir. Lisa's story, Triptych, appears in the Battle Ruins Bibliothekos anthology, as well as the story she's about to read from today.
I'm just going to launch right into my story. I guess if I had to sum it up in one word, one sentence rather, it would be a story about the life cycle and our place within it. And it's called Potatoes. In the late afternoon sunshine of September, Olivia knelt in the soil of her grandfather's garden, a lush, fertile secret hidden behind the busy streets of Brooklyn. Most of it grew in wild profusion, a tangle of flowers and bushes and old fruit-bearing trees that each year offered stunted apples, tart pears, and yellow cherries to the neighborhood's birds and squirrels. But on one side, against the high wooden fence that separated their yard from the neighbors, a wide strip of earth had been cleared for growing vegetables. Trowel in hand, Olivia could hear her grandmother's voice carrying through the screen of the window above the sink, calling to Olivia's sister in another room. Olivia's sister was older, married, with a baby on the way. The inviting smell of a roast wafted across the yard. Dinner would be ready soon. She carefully pressed the tip of the trowel into the soil, lifted the dirt, went a little deeper, tentatively, searchingly, until a small brown knot the size of an elongated ping-pong ball emerged. Olivia picked it up, sifted the dust off, and recognized the form of a potato, a miniature one, complete with tiny bumps and ridges on its rough brown surface. She turned the trowel to the soil and unearthed more potatoes, all of them minuscule, toy-like. She had misjudged. She had dug them up too soon. They had planted the potatoes in March, she and her grandfather, a month before her 11th birthday. She remembered how he had prepared a place for the potatoes in the moist earth, carefully loosening the soil and telling stories while he worked, as he often did, of the time when gods and goddesses entangled themselves in the affairs of the mortal world. Olivia helped by removing stray stones and pebbles, while her grandfather passed on the story of creation as Ovid had passed it on to the people of Rome millennia ago. All of nature had been one, her grandfather explained, a lumpy bundle of everything that existed without shape or order, a formless mass of matter in which all was chaos and confusion. The land and air and oceans, all the planets and stars, the earth and sun and moon, everything trapped inside a single body, forever at war. Heat fought with cold, wet with dry, hard things with soft, until some entity, God or nature, settled the dispute by liberating one from the other, so that the sky was separated from the earth, the water from land, and the world, altered as it was, could evolve out of the mayhem it had been. Everything was then free to find its place. The fish were given water to live in, the birds air, the four-legged animals the earth to run upon and make their home. But something was missing, something different, and so people were born, the only creatures that could stand erect and lift their faces to heaven. So you see, her grandfather concluded, that's why everything has its place. Olivia thought for a moment. It sounds a lot like the Bible story, she said. He nodded. I wonder how it happened for real, and when, how and when we all came to be. Who knows? Her grandfather got up from the ground, the knees of his dark green work pants brown with earth stains. It doesn't really matter, does it? Everything has its place, and that's what's important. From what she could figure, Olivia had to agree with him. There did seem to be a place for everything, a natural, unchanging order that could be counted on to endure. The animals and rocks, the forests and deserts, the flow of rivers and the stillness of the night sky, even the life of their family, 3 generations living contentedly together in one big, comfortable house. And now these potatoes, in their bed by the garden fence, growing slowly, silently, deep in the dark soil. Each year, for as long as she could remember, Olivia had watched her grandfather planting in the garden. The tomatoes, the basil and oregano, the peppers, had helped to turn the earth or just watched as he expertly tended the plants into maturity. She often would check the progress of the tomatoes, watch the small green knobs ripen into juicy red fruit hanging heavily on the vines. She would keep a vigil over the even surface of the soil, waiting for the slender stems of the young plants to break through so that she could be witness to their growth and the nurturing power of the sun and her grandfather's vigilant watering. But she and her grandfather had never planted potatoes before. This time they were doing something new, untried, an experiment in cultivation. There would be no way for her to monitor the life of the potatoes underground. Their evolution would be a mystery to her, a present to be opened when the time was right, and only her grandfather would be able to say when that would be. That's it, he said, after running the hose on the soil to water the potatoes. We're finished. She swirled the toe of her sneaker in the little rivulets of mud the water had made. What are you doing? He said gruffly. You're making a mess. He often sounded gruff. It was the way his words came out. I'm not doing anything, she said, continuing to swirl. She liked the way the muddy water made patterns as it drained off the rubber tip of her sneaker. Her grandfather shook his head and walked away. She saw him again at dinner, when he sat as he usually did, stoic and straight, a large glass of wine by his plate, and then later in the night when it was time to go to bed. He was sitting in his favorite room at the front of the house, in his easy chair by the long windows, watching television. On the screen in the corner, across from where he sat, a lion stalked gracefully through a golden grassland. The narrator's voice was deep and confidential. Olivia's grandfather leaned back in his chair, his head heavy against the green vinyl. He was open-mouthed, closed-eyed, snoring. The wall directly in front of him was shelved with Book of the Month Club selections, rows of National Geographic magazines, and a few of her grandmother's knickknacks scattered about. Olivia walked into the room to say goodnight. Her grandfather opened his eyes and leaned sleepily into her kiss as her lips brushed the soft lines of his cheek. His hair was silver and thin, brushed back from his forehead. As she was leaving, she glanced at the books and magazines. She noticed that the lion on the television had just leapt down from a magnificent rock, and in the background, the African sky was the color of a bonfire. There were worlds in that room, numberless kinds of people. A planet of changing continents and exotic wildlife began there. She did not know at the time that he had been sick. The adults had kept it from her. It was an enlarged heart, she learned later, one that could no longer work properly. Olivia knew only that for a long time he had to take it easy, could not eat certain foods, was told to eliminate from his diet the large glass of wine he always poured at dinner. And this, she only knew, from her mother and grandmother reprimanding him for violating some doctor's order or another. He did not listen to them. He enjoyed his small pleasures, his wine, his favorite foods. His heart was bad, he knew. Changing the habits of a lifetime would not cure him. He was 67 years old. Before his death that July, he had predicted the birth of the baby Olivia's sister was carrying. August 30th, he said. Olivia's sister disagreed. The doctor says mid-September. No, he said, August 30th. He had been witness to their courtship. Olivia's sister and her fiancé, when they would stay up late in her grandfather's kitchen and he would wander in from his front room to get a glass of water. Don't you think it's getting late, he would say. That was the signal for the evening to end. Good girls did not stay up all night with their young men. By the time her sister was married, their grandfather's illness had begun. The photos of him at the wedding showed a pale, drawn face, a tired smile hiding the inner war that was being waged inside his body. When he had first entered the hospital, Olivia went to visit him, and he was pleased that she, a child, had come to such a stark, sterile place to see him. She did not think there was any significance to the illusion that he somehow looked smaller to her in the hospital gown, smaller and drained, not the tall, strong man they knew at home. His arm hung with loose skin as he lifted it to offer a hug when she left, but that did not deter her from believing he would be okay. He would regain his strength, she knew. He needed this rest so that the doctors could heal him. She kissed the top of his forehead. It was the last time she saw him. The call from the hospital came one bitterly hot evening a few days later as Olivia was sitting in the upstairs living room with her father and grandmother. Olivia could hear her mother's voice on the phone in the hallway, the sound of the receiver hitting its cradle as she hung up. A few moments later, her mother was standing in the entranceway, limply leaning against the door jamb. At the sight of her, Olivia's grandmother crumpled into a chair. Her father, his face chiseled with grief, got up and went to them. Olivia felt a cavernous emptiness beginning to open up inside her. She was lost, caught between the hollowness of herself and the force of the raw pain before her eyes. What was this thing that had happened to them, this sudden, violent wrenching of their lives? In the days that followed, she watched the adults solemnly stumble through their days, making funeral arrangements, talking teary-eyed into the phone when friends and family called. One day, visitors she had never seen before showed up at their house. They wore dark clothes and frowns of empathy as they shook their heads and spoke in low tones to her mother and grandmother. She did not attend the wake or the funeral. She was told not to. To see him like that, the body without the man, would have been too difficult, they felt, and so she remained home with relatives, unwilling to think of him resting in a coffin, soon to be lowered into the soft, moist earth. It was not until later, in their dull, stupefied grief, that her mother pointed out an oddity. While the electricity remained on, the kitchen clock, plugged into the wall, had stopped at the time of her grandfather's death. They took it as a sign. He was with them still and always would be. Yet it did little to still their pain. Nothing could detract their attention until the following month, when Olivia's sister delivered the baby to lighten their mourning. The child, a girl, was born on the 30th of August. Now, a month after the birth, Olivia was carrying back to the house in a brown paper lunch bag the tiny potatoes over which she and her grandfather had labored 6 months earlier. "They're too small," she said to her mother, who was setting the table, and to her grandmother, who was busy at the stove. They both turned to look as Olivia pulled out one of the potatoes and held it up. She called to her sister in the front room to come and take a look. "How cute," her sister said, looking at the tiny growth in Olivia's outstretched hand. Olivia could feel the frown of disappointment on her face. "Cute?" Her mother smiled. "It's okay," she said. "Sometimes when a vegetable is small, it has a sweeter taste." Her grandmother asked, "How do you want to eat them?" "French fries," she said. "Tiny little French fries." She got to work on peeling the skins, while her grandmother pulled out a small frying pan from one of the cabinets. Olivia covered the bottom of the pan with a layer of olive oil, turned on the gas, then neatly sliced the potatoes over the stove, letting the thin pieces fall directly onto the oil. This was the closest she had ever come to cooking. She did not like the idea of cooking, but there she was, frying potatoes and not minding at all. As the French fries sizzled to a crispy golden color, her father came into the kitchen, followed by her sister and brother-in-law. The table was set, with spaces left for the steaming platters of meat and fresh vegetables that her grandmother would place before them. The baby was in her bassinet by the window. Olivia soon took her place at the table, and that evening they all tasted the fruit of the potato harvest in honor of her grandfather. Olivia's mother was right. In their smallness, the potatoes were sweet. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And we would like now to re-welcome Anne Whitehouse. Anne Whitehouse has been here before. Reading of the first Bibliothekos anthology, Pain and Memory. Anne has some poetry in that. We had that reading in 2009. And in fact, Mitch Levenberg was on that panel, who's here as well. But today, Anne is going to be reading from her selections in Being Human, and she has 2 prose pieces in there. So it comes as no surprise, Anne is a poet and fiction writer who hails originally from Alabama. I noticed that comes up in your bios. I've read a lot of Anne's books. And she's published a lot. The most recent of which is The Refrain. I've read it. It's outside for sale, as well as Janice's novel, Hollywood Boulevard. So, Anne, you ready?
I'd like to thank Professor Gregory Tague and Frederica Jacks, Editions Bibliothekos and St. Francis College for hosting this event, and also Lisa and Janice, my co-readers. The 2 stories in Being Human, Call of the Wild, The Sun's Complaint, and Spirals Around 2 Peaks are connected in that they were written in sequence, and the nameless protagonist in Spirals could be an older version of the sun in The Sun's Complaint. The stories are located in that territory between poetry and prose. In the first story, the son is haunted by his current family and his ancestral family, the pioneers who settled the wilderness and with hard labor wrested a living from the land. As he contemplates their history, the son is haunted by visions of the wildness they have destroyed and the wildlife that was slaughtered. He mourns the loss of that old world, and at the same time he feels oppressed by the patriarchal family. His father, like his father's fathers before him, is a rationalist who subjects everything in his environment to quantification and exactingly doles out the fruits of his labors. This is his role and privilege as family provider, but he is one step removed from the ancestors. While they hunted their meat, he purchases it, but he owns it as surely as they did. I'm going to read the first 2 paragraphs from the son's complaint and then skip ahead to the middle of the story. Then I'll introduce Spirals Around 2 Peaks and read a selection from it. The son's complaint. A boy toboggans down a white hill. The red slash of his coat rushes past trees. In the deaf world, he encounters nothing living but himself and the solid trees. So began the recurring dream of the child of the family who, when awake, sat in the insulated basement reading his books and papers. The books were scientific treatises that he pored over, for he'd been taught they were keys to enlightenment. He sought to uncover the epistemological bases of abstract systems. He pondered tragic error. His mother, who aspired to be guardian of the genealogical record, had assembled the papers, which were the surviving documents of the family's history. In old photographs, he studied the doer images of his ancestors. Their faded correspondence, detailed with inventions and projects, became his basement bulwark. The ceiling vibrated under the heavy steps of his brothers. Heat rose in the thick pipes. On certain fixed occasions, the family gathered for a ritual meal. Small talk and clinking glasses filled the living room, where, under a flower-printed sofa and chairs, the green lawn of a rug covered the floor, domesticated outdoors. The grown children balanced on the edges of their chairs, sipping fiery drinks that brought on thirst. When the gong rang, they removed themselves to the dining table. Steam rose from the uncovered dishes and slowly worked into their eyes. The father had lounged while his wife shopped and cooked. Now the rights were all his. First was the ceremony of dismembering the meat. The side of an animal dominated the table. Brown juice ran down the crinkled fat and over the ribs that once had protected the animal's heart. The father wielded the steel, the brown crusted slices piled up on the plate. He apportioned the servings of the expensive meal his earnings had purchased. Except for the last son, the children's growth surpassed their parents. They required more sustenance than formerly. Still, they did not enjoy the thick meat. The chewed fibers caught between their teeth, but they ate more. Their lips glistened. Dark wine shone blood red on teeth and palate and stained the corners of their mouths. Outside, the snow seemed to drop from nowhere. It settled and whirled up and settled again in the same place. As the children ate, they recalled the names of extinct animals. They described the poisoning of marsh and forest, lake and river, as if they were discussing a patient whose prognosis they'd already judged fatal. It could be argued that even the food they were eating had been poisoned. Under their clothes, their skin was blotched with sweat. The house's painted walls were warm to the touch. They criticized the interior heat that made an artificial summer in the winter's midst. Rinds of fat curled on their plates. Licking their forks, shaking the last drops of wine down their throats, they decried the flagrance of their father's waste. A hum vibrated in the mother's throat. She wanted to drown her children's accusations. Her nervous smile never reached her eyes. In a high, piercing voice, she tried to coax her family into agreement. The ruby jelly quivered in the glass. But the father would not be placated. He reiterated his rights. Once his large children had cowered before his will. Now they felt a sadness beyond rancor. Although he fed them, he still denied them. Like his brothers, the child of the family had eaten. He laid his silver across his plate. He looked outside. The mercury had climbed, and a hesitant rain fell on the snow. The others left the table, their big feet printing the rug's pile. Worn out by the meal, the father napped on the couch. Alone, the son stood in the empty dining room. No one living wanted to know him for what he was. He thought he forgot himself, just as he thought after his long basement sojourn, he no longer recalled the sound of rain falling on the roof. Yet he found he not only remembered, but anticipated the animal-like hiss of the dropping rain. He felt an earlier self listening too, more timid and capable of wonder, watching the blank windowed houses, the round bushes, the poles of trees, and unrelieved flatness of the yard and street. A lattice of branches veined the sky. The windless rain left pockmarks in the melting snow. It was then they came back, the dead relatives. While his father slept in the living room, the dishes clattered from his mother's fingers into the dishwasher, and his brothers took their boisterous ire into another part of the house. A man in a stovepipe hat stood under a lantern in the yard. The light fell in slanting rays on the snow, illumining the gentle, silent rain. The man was smoking an elaborate curved pipe. The son recognized him from photographs, inventor of several useful machines, entrepreneur and family autocrat, from whom survived a long vitriolic letter, wordy with self-righteousness, reproaching a wastrel younger brother. Through the window glass, the son heard him tap his pipe against the steel lamppost. A faint pink haze hung in the air, perhaps a reflection off the snow. The man was silent, as befits the dead. After emptying the bowl, he slipped his pipe into his breast pocket and, looking left and right, crossed the empty street and disappeared from the son's view. A woman came next, running, almost tripping on her long skirts. She carried an umbrella that rose and fell with her exertions. She, too, passed under the lantern. Oval raindrops slowly slid down the hollows between the umbrella's ribs. She was looking at the house. How close she seemed. The son saw how the loose wisps of her hair had collected droplets of moisture. She turned toward the window where he watched, his nose flattened against the glass, his features dark, the light behind him. She nodded. He couldn't mistake her invitation. He didn't recognize her face from any family album, lovely in a soft way his people never had. Her cheek glistened. He was utterly still. Her face was near, but her smile was as distant as pale spring. She seemed about to step toward him when, from the periphery of his vision, the man returned, walking with a swift frontier gait. He took her arm, whether lightly or cruelly, the son couldn't tell. Just once, she glanced back at the pure circle of light on the shrinking snow. And I'm going to stop there in the middle of the story and go on to Spirals Around Two Peaks. As I mentioned in the beginning, the narrator of this story could be an older version of the son in the son's complaint. Only now he is grown, and like his ancestors who traveled westward, he has continued the migration and gone as far as he can to the edge of the continent to California. However, unlike his ancestors, he does not seek to conquer and subdue nature, but to live in harmony with it. When he migrates westward, he leaves behind a miserable existence as a hospital orderly. On his way out west, he camps in the wilderness, and the experience begins to heal him. The two peaks of the titles are the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Madres. The spirals refer to his mental and physical wanderings in these landscapes. I'm going to read from the beginning, which locates the protagonist in California and describes his journey there. The selection will end with his spiral around the first peak. Spirals around two peaks. Over the planet, vast migrations are occurring. By the sounds, he knows what he cannot see with his little eyes. That immense sheets of ice are cracking, and all the water in the world is rising, tumbling. It curls down rocks. It roars. In the deep lakes, fish in their first larval stage are leaving the shingle beds where their eggs were laid. What they know of life is a journey they did not begin. They are carried by a current, propelled by a wind they cannot conceive of. Everything moves before them but the fixed rock and its silky mantle of sand. He does not know how they sense direction and stem the current, how they decide on their own way. The rivers rise, the world expands its levels, flocks of birds are flying to nest. Herds move across the plains, and in the forests, insects slowly unfurl their thin legs. Trailing their calves, singing their eerie songs, the whales swim to the distant poles. He is dreamy and disconsolate, and the world, which tendered invitations to the landlocked boy, now at the last gate at the continent's edge, denies him. Did he misread the signals? He remembers the stiff dead under their white sheets and the screech of the wheels as he rolled them down fluorescent-lit corridors. It was neither night nor day. Like Sharon poling his ferry, he accepted payment for his service. The creamy concrete walls, the echoing linoleum, the overhead lights suspended from a cracking ceiling were all he saw of roads, but he knew what others shunned, life's last ignominy before ceding to death. The care he gave was useless, but giving flowed from him like an endless wave. Yet the sea rising would fall. At last he retreated. He took little with him. Name the ways in which less is more. His driving was content but capricious. Sometimes he stopped by a yellow field and got out to feel the emptiness of the sky. But the towns he passed were changing. They no longer faced the land but grew towards each other, always more alike. They imported their buildings ready-made, just as they imported their citizens. They still believed in growth. These people he glimpsed through the windshields of other cars and overheard at breakfasts and diners had a pink indoor look. Their bones seemed already softened, as if they were dissolving internally. They had never thought of being forgotten. Like the others, they had come to claim possession. The land hid things they hoped to detect with their shiny instruments and extract with the powerful machines they had brought with them, for the rock was so hard and deep that only an immense force could break it. Safely distant, they pushed the controls that ignited explosions. An orange flare lit the sky. He left the landscape being laid to waste and drove towards the mountains they could not yet topple. There could be no reconciliation. An ache grew inside his nostrils when he saw the ranging peaks, as if he were already inhaling their cold glitter. He had read the accounts of others who had been moved by the eternal snows. He imagined discovering at the foot of an uneasy pyramid of boulders an alpine columbine, tiny deep blue spurs ringing its white cup. He admired the blossoms whose miniature perfection was confined to mountains. He was seeking an inaccessible place. Thank you.
Tell us about your narrator. Where did that narrator come from? If you want, you can either stand here or roam with the mic.
Well, never be at a loss for an answer. Well, the narrator kind of came out of me, I guess. I hear a voice pretty much. And if it keeps going, I start writing it down, and that evolves into a character, and then that character starts to tell me what's going on. As I said in my preface, I did write this piece in New Hampshire, and it's possible the narrator heard a tree speak. So in this is a fairly organic story for me, unusually organic, and so I think that character came out of that environment pretty much, pretty dead on. That's generally how I work. I hear a character.
First of all, thank you very much for your reading. I'm interested in the strong sense of place in all three, and how you think that connects with being human.
I'm always accused, happily, of having a strong sense of place. I don't think you can be human without being someplace. And I think as a writer, it's very important to both the reader and the writer that the character be in a place. That becomes the, sort of, for me, that becomes the supporting ballast, I guess, of both the story and the character. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that we're all products of our environment. I think that comes from my anthropology background, that we are, we develop from what's around us and what we grow up with. And in my particular story, mine was, the sense of place came from my own sense of place of having had a home like that and growing up in that type of an environment.
These two stories are really about human history and natural history. And I was thinking about the idea of the continent and how we settled it and the history of our exploitation of the continent, and then now people today that want to preserve it. And so, and just thinking about sort of the Midwest and then California. So
I just wanted to say thank you to the English department for sponsoring this, the honors program, the Office of Special Events, Media Relations, and also the Evolutionary Studies Collaborative. So what we can do now is head on over to the Callahan Center. We can continue the conversation. We can have some light refreshments. And there are books there. If you want to buy any, they can be signed by the authors. So thank you, everyone, for coming.